Hi, and welcome to this edition of Financial Planning Innovation. It's my pleasure to have on the line Phil Lubinski. Phil's a retirement income professional. He's been in the business for many years, and in particular, he developed this software program to help other planners out there with their clients. Thanks for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. This is great.
So, I want to hear a little bit about the early days, first of all. How did you get into the retirement income planning world?
It was actually by accident. I had a friend that was an advisor who was doing seminars, corporate seminars for employees that were usually on a 5 year or less countdown to when they'd be eligible to retire. And there was one coming up that he wasn't going to be able to do, and he asked me if I would be willing to fill in for him, and I did it, and it was so much fun. And but people were actually coming up to me and saying, "Hey, could we come in and meet with you?" Usually I was having to call people and begging them to let me come meet with them. And they were now coming to me. So I said, why don't we form a company? Why don't we specialize in this? And he said, well, these seminars are organized by a nonprofit group here in Denver. And the guy who orchestrates all of that, he's the one that sets them up. And I said, well, then let's go talk with him. And so we talked with him and convinced him that the three of us should partner up, form a separate company, and then we just went into the corporate seminar business at that point.
And I know even to this day, you're still doing webinars. So the method of delivering these messages and this education hasn't changed all that much. Just the platforms have changed a bit with the technology.
Right. Yeah. And when I started in the business, it was always a one-on-one presentation. And I mean, if you can do a one-on-20, it's certainly a lot more efficient than one-on-one.
Yeah, and I could just tell you have that productivity gene, so to speak, where we love efficiencies here too. And this is about innovation. So I know in the early days, even you were developing software to help you with these retirement income planning meetings. What did it look like? Kind of your first software programs that you were developing?
Well, the first software, I guess, was something called Lotus 123, which was the predecessor to Excel. So it was just all spreadsheets. It was very manual, and it was a very labor-intensive process. And then that evolved to where I was teamed up with a big financial planning company called Financial Profiles out of Carlsbad, California, because the strategy was working so well that the company that where my licenses were and I did my business through decided that they wanted to kind of roll it out in a much bigger way than just my office. And so they developed a whole separate module. They called it the Post-Retirement Navigator. And it had a nautical theme that said, you're going to be going across retirement's ocean, and do you have enough barrels of supplies to get you through all weather conditions? And because I'm Polish, whenever I did speaking at their conferences, they always started them off with the beer barrel polka music. And then I would come out and they'd have all these. And so it was really a fun software, and it made a lot of sense.
That's cool. And then to kind of fast forward to today, and I know you're still developing new software, and you have something called WealthConductor, correct, as a company that's doing this. Tell me a little bit about that software program.
So yeah, WealthConductor, the actual software is called Income Conductor. It's based on the same exact strategy as I used back in the 80s. So it's a segmented or bucketing strategy where you're creating time horizons across an individual's retirement, and then creating separate portfolios for different periods of time in their retirement. The big difference now in this software, now being the third one that I've co-developed, is that it really has a major focus on the ongoing management of the plan, of the strategy. So the prior ones kind of laid out a proposal to a client, but then if you were going to monitor everything as you should against what your original projections were, you had to do it manually. So if you had one or two clients in retirement, it was no big deal. But I had 200 clients in retirement, and to manage over 1,000 different accounts for those 200 clients required so much staff and so much time. It was just very, very labor intensive. Advisors didn't want to do that and spend that kind of time. So we automated all that with Income Conductor and made it a very efficient. But its core is still the same religion that it was back in the 80s.
Right. I'm sure it wasn't that different from the Lotus 1, 2, 3 approach, just modernized and made more efficient. And now there's a lot more tools and solutions and different ways to help clients in
Right.
retirement with the decumulation component of this. So the two differentiators, it sounds like you have this bucketing approach and then this monitoring of the different portfolios you're creating. Tell us a little bit about the buckets and how does that look in the software?
So the buckets are just they're time horizons. So if a retiree comes in and you decide between the two of you that a 30-year time horizon is adequate, then you break that up into bite-sized time horizons. So let's say into five-year time horizons. So if I can identify mathematically of a client's total money, how much they're not going to need until the last 5 years of their retirement, I can create a portfolio that I know it's going to be left alone for 25 years, and that can be invested pretty aggressively. But then for their immediate income that they're going to need for the first 5 years, I don't want to take any market risk in that.
Mm-hmm.
So I want their income to not at all be impacted by what goes on daily in the markets, like we've had extreme volatility, particularly the last couple of days.
Hmm.
But over this last 10 years, as good as the markets have been, there's still been a lot of volatility. But at least with this strategy, the client knows that their income is coming from a place where it's absolutely guaranteed. And then one by one, we go through the segments or the buckets. And when it's time for it to be converted to income, it's moved to that guaranteed income bucket, while the others continue to reinvest and grow and go through the market cycles and hopefully hit their targets that were originally projected.
Yeah, and it seems like it's a very intuitive approach. I know a lot of the softwares out there, they set a goal and they do a number of simulations and they look at the likelihood of success. You're actually looking at, a very discrete set of events which, allow them to manage that risk, in a different type of way, correct?
It is, and so each bucket would have a probability of success, I guess.
Hmm.
But when you take a whole plan, so the rule of thumb has always been kind of this 4% rule, where
Hmm.
you set up one portfolio and you take 4% from it, and then you do a Monte Carlo, a probability testing.
Hmm.
But it's the probability of the entire plan. And when the probability fails, so like Monte Carlo may come back and say this has an 80% probability of success, which is deemed to be very acceptable. But that means 20% of the time it fails, and failure with that kind of probability testing means the client went broke.
Hmm.
And that's not good news to a retiree. I mean, you wouldn't get on a flight that only has an 80% probability of reaching its destination. And yet in financial planning, we seem to think that that's perfectly acceptable. Where here, we have maybe a probability that there could be a period of time where they'd have to accept a little less income than what we had originally forecasted, but they're never going to go broke. So when I've said to a client, I could create a plan that has some probability of you going broke, or I could create a plan that has some probability that for a short period of time along the way, you may have to accept less income. I've never had a client say, yeah, give me that one where I could go broke. They say we could always figure out how to get by on less income, but we certainly can't get by on no income.
Right. And I know you had mentioned to me there's also a spending module in it too. So when you're constantly monitoring it, they can adjust their spending accordingly depending on whether they're on target with their plan, right?
Right. So we're plotting a projected spending curve, and which isn't going to be totally accurate over a 30-year period of time, but we're creating a baseline of spending. And then when we review with clients, we're constantly not only monitoring how are the investment portfolios doing, but how is their spending doing? Because it can be as volatile sometimes as the markets are. And so we need to have this baseline to measure their changing needs along the way and make sure that their spending is staying within an acceptable range so that long term the plan is going to work.
Well, the other thing that I find remarkable is you've been using this approach for a long time, and obviously the software has changed, and that's been what's so innovative. But I know you had a story about a client that early on you began this with that client. Tell us a little bit about that experience and just seeing this plan all the way through.
Yeah, he was an experiment on this because he was an engineer, an aerospace engineer, had done all of his own investing when I first met him, and he was offered a early retirement incentive from his employer. And so he came to me and said, I'm looking for an advisor that works with retirees And I want to make sure that they have a strategy that makes sense to not only just me, but to me and my wife, and somebody that both me and my wife like and trust. So we had several meetings together, and they decided that they liked the strategy, they liked the bucketing, they liked me okay. And he was, for him, it was important because he assumed that he would die first, and he wanted her to have a relationship in place so that she wasn't out looking for an advisor at probably the worst possible time in her life.
Mm-hmm.
So everything lined up, and that was in 1985. And in 2016, he died. And when we first met, he didn't want me to do a plan past age 80 because he didn't think he'd make it past 80. And I said, I don't think so. I said, I want to do it to 90. So will you go with me? Mm-hmm. And he said, sure. Well, he died at 88. So he was wrong and I was wrong, I guess. But his wife is still alive. And at his funeral, his wife came up to me and she says, I remember the day that we decided to go with you. And I just want to tell you right now, and all her children were there too. And she said, actually, we want to tell you how grateful we are that my husband met you when he did.
That is so cool. And did you meet with them to review this plan every single year?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah. And, a couple times with him because, being an engineer, because he would bring in, just gobs of spreadsheets and show me what he had analyzed. So yeah, we either talked on the phone, but we always had a formal review at least once a year.
Very cool. Well, I appreciate you being on the show today. We have so much more we could talk about, so I hope to have you on future episodes. And hopefully people out there are going to see your software program that you're using and use some technologies like it, or maybe the Income Conductor itself, because I think it can make everyone's experience with their clients so much better, like you've kind of exhibited here today.
It really does. And just, tell people to go to incomeconductor.com. Mm-hmm. And they can see all about the software. And we have a free trial for advisors. So, and every week we have a little demo of it so that they can sign up for. So I appreciate the opportunity to be on this with you.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll put some links in the article so they can actually go straight to your website to do that. So we'll have you on future episodes. And again, thanks again for joining us, Phil.
Okay. Thanks, Mark.